Good morning and welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar. I hope we find you well wherever you are on this unusually crisp and frosty morning, certainly here in the southeast. The Signpost series is brought to you in conjunction with Dairy Sustainability Ireland, Food Drink Ireland Skillnet and the National Rural Network. This morning we are delighted to be joined by Dahi Keelan from UCD, a postdoc researcher from UCD. Dahi, if you take off your mute, and also by Dominica Kroll, who's a researcher in Teagasc Johnstown Castle on gaseous emissions research. Dahi and Dominica, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Everyone, thank you for
Good morning,
having us.
everyone.
We're also joined by Pádraig Foley to help with the questions later on. So this morning's topic is on reducing the emissions from ammonia and trajectories for ammonia emissions. Dahi, I think you're up first if you want to share your presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. So we'll start off with what is ammonia. It's a compound of nitrogen and hydrogen, formula of NH. So for every one nitrogen molecule, there's 3 hydrogen molecules. It's colorless gas. Its characteristic pungent smell. You might not realize you know what it smells like, but if you've ever driven by, Slurry Spreading or a pig house, you have certainly caught a whiff of ammonia in that smell. It has a short residency time in the atmosphere. It readily reacts with other chemicals to form particulate matter. So ammonia itself is a problem locally, and there's usually a high local deposition and impacts rising from that. But then the particulate matter, which is formed through the atmospheric chemical reactions, that can actually be transported several kilometers away and is a problem much further away. And in combination from both the local ammonia and the particulate matter, there's impacts on both the environment and human health. So where does ammonia come from? In Ireland, 99% comes from agriculture. Across Europe, then that actually decreases a little bit because there's other non-agricultural sources. In and around 6.7% comes from non-agriculture, so things like biomass burning, a little bit from traffic as well. About 43.5% of emissions across Europe comes from fertilizers. So that's a combination of inorganic, synthetic, and organic, that's animal manure. Whereas 28.3% comes from cattle and 18.2% from pig and poultry. So that's really coming from the manure management of these animals and how the emissions come from the combination of slurry and urine coming from them and various manures, etc. But then there's contributions from other animals, sheep, goats, and horses contribute a small percentage, 2.9%, but they're the real heavy hitters in terms of emissions across Europe. So, unlike greenhouse gases, I know we talk about emissions and contributions to national ceilings, etc. So, where greenhouse gases are contributing towards international problems, ammonia is different because it really contributes to local problems, and it's a problem locally. So, usually where you have high emissions, you will have high impacts locally because it contributes to direct impacts on the local environment. So something like carbon trading, where you can trade between countries, isn't really possible because the impact is occurring where the emissions are higher. So it's really down to where the emissions are occurring and what sensitive habitats or what habitats are downwind of where the emissions are occurring. And again, once you follow the pathway of ammonia after it's been emitted and its chemical transformation and things like particulate matter, it contributes to total nitrogen deposition much further away, and also to human health impacts. Much further away. It actually is a substantial contribution to particulate matter, and even in urban areas, which I'll talk a little bit more in a while. So on the right, I've just got 2 pictures in the bottom. You can see that's sphagnum moss on a bog which has been impacted by ammonia. It's starting to decay. It's all slimy. And then similarly on a tree on a bog, you can see all this green algae is starting to appear, which is again another indicator I'll talk a little bit more about in a while. So as to summarize that slide, it's essentially, unlike greenhouse gases, it's a problem locally, so it should be dealt with locally, and it something like carbon trading isn't really possible. So in terms of what actually impacts on the ground ecologically, how do you define what an impact is? These are done by 2 mechanisms, which are critical levels and critical loads. And what they are essentially is a critical level is a threshold, so contribution of ammonia in the atmosphere. So concentration of ammonia gas in the air that will cause an impact. Whereas a critical load is how much nitrogen is being deposited underground, which will cause an impact primarily through eutrophication. So the concentrations at which you would get an impact from, i.e. a critical level, are 1 and 3 micrograms per meter cube, which are relatively, low concentrations, difficult enough to detect in the air without using equipment like passive samplers, for example. So the critical loads are a little bit more complex as they incorporate all other forms of reactive nitrogen being deposited, including wet and dry. So the difference between wet and dry deposition is wet deposition is when ammonia is pulled out through the rain and deposited in the ground, whereas dry deposition is through the likes of plant surfaces. So it's direct contact with the air and a plant surface. So the more plant surface you have, the more ammonia will be deposited on the ground. And they're based on a 30-year average because they're really intended to look at long-term impacts and changes across these communities. However, the currently used empirical critical loads may be too high to actually protect ecology in Ireland, because recent work being led by University of Trent in Canada has really showed that you get species community change points at deposition rates much lower than the empirical critical loads. And on the right, I have a table here with just some example habitats. So for the different heathlands, you've got empirical critical loads of 10 to 15 and 10 to 20 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. But on the ground, what you're actually seeing is you get impacts much lower at around 4.9 and 4.1 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. So really the habitat is being impacted when the species community changes rather than when the 10 to 15 kilograms is being deposited on the site. I'm going in a little bit more detail for the semi-natural dry grasslands. I've got the slide up here, or the image up here on the top is actually, that's the data that's being used to derive these community change points. So each black line is a nitrogen sensitive species and each red line is a nitrogen tolerant species. So you can see as the deposition increases along the bottom, so from 6 to 10 to 12 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year, you start to see sensitive species are dropping off and tolerant species are increasing. So the species community change point is here right around 8.3, but you've actually already lost some nitrogen sensitive species by the time you get to that point. So even at around 6 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year, even below the vegetation community change points, you're starting to lose species. So impacts are they're complicated, and there is work ongoing on them, and there's upcoming meetings that will define future empirical critical loads based on this accumulated research, because this research is occurring across Europe and the world too, because a lot of work has been done in the US on this recently as well. So it's looking likely that these critical loads will drop to reflect the fact that these impacts are occurring at much lower deposition rates than previously thought. Now, what happens when these deposition rates are exceeded and these concentrations are exceeded? So the impacts are coming from direct toxicity of ammonia, from the eutrophication as reactive nitrogen. So it's adding more nutrients to a habitat than it's evolved to be able to withstand. And there's factors like acidification of the deposited nitrogen as well, which isn't as important as the toxicity and eutrophication, but it's still part of the picture. So what this will result in is, impacts on sensitive species. So as I mentioned earlier, sphagnums are hugely important for bogs. Without sphagnum, you don't have a bog. So the picture on the right here is a colleague of mine. She's holding in her hand one hand, the brown slimy stuff that's impacted sphagnum, and then on the right is healthy sphagnum. So you won't see that sphagnum on sites that aren't being impacted by ammonia because it's contributing to these impacts, which will limit the ability of that site to meet its conservation objectives, and it'll impact the site, and it also affects the site's ability to act as a carbon sink as well, reducing the amount of carbon that these peatlands can take in. You also get proliferation of nitrophytic species. These are species that love nitrogen. Like, algal slimes is a really good one to start with, because on the bottom right we can see the tree on the left is beautifully healthy tree, beautiful epiphytic lichen community. On the right, that's in an area that's being impacted with ammonia, thick, nasty algal slimes. So you don't need a doctor to realize that the one on the left is better than the one on the right. And again, these are indicators which are reflecting the impacts that are occurring, but across communities you're getting much wider impacts affecting the entire ecosystem. So essentially, the summation of this is that, well, ammonia is a significant threat to conservation of Irish habitats, which is particularly important when we're looking at what we need to protect legally under the European Union Habitats Directive, specifically sites within the Natura 2000 network of designated sites. So no plan or project which allows any impact on these sites can be permitted. So these sites are supposed to be pristine. We're supposed to be doing, Ireland's supposed to be doing, every European member state is supposed to do the best they can to protect these sites. So a number of which are designated for active raised bogs, as I mentioned earlier. So theoretically, a Natura 2000 site shouldn't be able to exceed concentrations that would cause an impact. However, based on the most recently available concentration model, which I'll talk about a little bit later, there's no Natura 2000 site for active raised bogs which falls below the threshold for impact, i.e. they're all impacted. There's only 2 which even have concentrations that fall below the site, so that's Loch Corrib and River Moist. They're quite large SACs, and they're the only 2 that even have a concentration that's below the critical level for these sites. And so the gray bars here are actually the average concentration across the site, and then the error bar is, so the high is for the maximum, and then the bottom error bar is for the minimum. So even on many of these sites, even the minimum concentration does not fall below the critical level for these sites. But it's not just, we're not just relying on modeled data, because you need to physically monitor, well, how much ammonia is occurring on these Natura 2000 sites. So I was involved in a project where we monitored just 12 sites. And similarly, again, on all raised bogs we monitored, they all exceeded their critical levels and loads for impacts from ammonia and nitrogen deposition. Only 2 sites fell below the critical level for lichens and mosses. That's for the critical level of 1 microgram per meter cubed, both of which were upland sites. The second, which was, the Wicklow Mountains, actually exceeded its critical load because of contribution from upwind agriculture to the wet deposition on the site. So the wet deposition actually kicked it up above its critical load, where you're looking at the total nitrogen deposition on the site. Now, where are these impacts physically coming from on these sites? It's not just from intensive hotspot sources, i.e., pigs and poultry. You also have impacts from passive sources. So one of these sites, Raheenmore Bog in County Offaly, we monitored the concentration of 2.3 micrograms per meter cubed. So it's under the 3 microgram per meter cubed threshold for higher plants, but above the 1 for designated for more sensitive lichens and mosses, which is what should be applied to raised bogs. So there's no hotspot sources of ammonia nearby. Coast is 3 kilometers downwind. The only local sources of ammonia are adjacent dairy farming and slurry spreading. And in addition to exceeding the critical level, there was also numerous ecological indicators of effects on these sites. Again, this algae was proliferating on all the header. So the bottom right, as you can see, that green algae proliferating across the Cluna vulgaris. And on the tree here, again, you see there's still indicators of some nitrogen nitrogen sensitive species. I think that's Ramalina on the tree, but they're all being encroached by this algae again, which is coming across the site as a direct result from ammonia and nitrogen deposition. Now, it's not just the environment we need to worry about in terms of ammonia, because PM2.5 is a substantial thing that we need to consider for human health. So this forms from reactions of ammonia in the air with nitrogen dioxide and sulfur dioxide, primarily, other pollutants as well. So PM2.5 passes through the lungs and into the bloodstream. And even in cases where where you have an extra 10 micrograms per meter cubed of PM2.5 in the air, you have an increase of 1% in hospital admissions. So there's been a lot of work done to tie the PM2.5 to actual real world impacts. So it's been often cited that managing ammonia emissions is actually the best route to reduce urban PM2.5 as well, because in Europe, 50%, so that's 50% of urban PM2.5, so that's in areas far away from agriculture, is formed from agricultural ammonia being emitted further away. So we need to look at what the emissions are occurring across the country. So there was work done by Map Era in the University of Aarhus, which mapped the national emissions map for ammonia, how much ammonia is emitted per kilometer squared. A concentration model was developed by UKCEH, UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and UCD, where what we did is we model how much the ammonia is being emitted, and then how the meteorological information spreads this ammonia across the land, and how much is deposited, and essentially models the concentration that would occur following the integration of meteorological data onto the emissions. So this will predict the concentrations across the sites. You can use that to calculate your critical level exceedances, and then subsequently also work out your total nitrogen deposition. And again, look, ammonia is highly seasonally and spatially variable. So concentrations, as I said earlier, is highly dependent on local emissions. So this is actually a video of the concentration model across Ireland. So you can see now we're in January, quite low concentrations. We're not even hitting 1 across most of the country yet. But if we flash forward, into June, then we start to see, okay, it was much higher now. We're talking more 6 to 10 micrograms per meter cubed. In areas, we're above 16. And you see these pulses of red as emissions increase during the day, because you're also diurnally variable as well. So you've got higher emissions during the day than you do during the night. So therefore, concentrations are also diurnally variable alongside the emissions. And then we flash forward again to November, December, they're starting to decrease again. So essentially, they're highest when warm and lowest when cold. So, but when you're looking at in terms of the impacts, you need to average that across the year, because the annual average critical level is what's used to assess contribution to impacts. And then as for critical loads, is actually over 30 years. And just to highlight it again, so the National Emission Ceiling Directive, just to point this out quickly, it was originally intended to limit national emissions. So to set national emission ceilings thresholds for each European member state. It's been recently updated so that now that every European member state also needs to consider, well, what are the impacts of these emissions on sensitive habitats? So each member state needs to set up a national monitoring network to monitor air quality and air quality impacts on sensitive habitats and ecosystems, intended to monitor long-term effects of air pollution. So monitoring things, for example, like ammonia concentrations, nitrogen deposition, vegetative community responses, percent tissue of nitrogen and mosses, nitrogen content soils, etc. It's a wide-ranging network covering many topics. And that's my last slide. Thank you very much for paying attention. I'll pass it on to Dominica Kroll. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dai. Really informative, and I suppose the notion that the impacts are just really local, where there's a source in terms of the impact on habitats. I think you kind of blew it out of the water a little bit in that I suppose the conglomeration or the bringing together of all those local sources make almost everywhere or most of the places that we're trying to protect susceptible, regardless of whether there's kind of heavy emitting agricultural activity in the locality.
Yep, very much so.
Yeah, really interesting.
Thank you,
Dominica.
So I'll move on then from those kind of concentrations and impacts of ammonia locally to, as Dahi made it very clear, they come from agricultural sources. So I'll go into a little bit more detail of where exactly they come from and what solutions we have with regards to mitigating those emissions. So first of all, just wanted to show you where we are in regards to emissions. So what Dahi was talking about, a lot of it is concentrations and then leading to critical loads and nitrogen deposition. It basically all starts with ammonia emissions. The more emissions, the higher concentration. So our ammonia emissions have been stable. Here you can see from 1990 all the way to maybe around 2010. We've been kind of bouncing up and down a little bit, but we were relatively stable. And then you can see that increasing trend starting from around 2011, and we are on the upward trend. So the most recent data that the EPA recorded is 2019, which is a little bit down. So we'll see how that trend evolves over time. At the moment, it still kind of looks like it's increasing. So the increasing trend has been so much that actually in the last reporting period, so in the last 10 years between 2010 and 2019, we've actually been non-compliant with the National Emission Ceilings Directive for 7 out of the 10 years. So what you see here in the bottom row of that table is our allowable ceiling, so how much ammonia we can emit every year, and all the emissions indicated in red are where we exceeded our limit. Okay, and that's historically. Now, how that's going to look like going forward, according to EPA projections, if we don't if we just use our existing mitigation measures, so the top row of that table, we will be non-compliant in the next 10 years, so 2020, 2025, all the way to 2030. And that's because we have our reduction commitments are even more stringent now than between 2010 and 2019. So against the backdrop of more and more reductions being needed in ammonia emissions, we're actually going in the opposite direction. Now, the second projection that you see here at the bottom here is what the EPA projects ammonia emissions will be in the following years with additional measures. So how those additional measures are modelled, they're basically based on a lot of research that's been done in Teagasc and incorporated into what's called Marginal Abatement Cost Curve, so MAC curve for ammonia. So if we fully adopt measures from the ammonia MAC, we can actually get compliant with ammonia regulations around 2025 and still be compliant for the rest of the commitment period. So, you know, which is a really good news that there is a pathway to compliance there. So what exactly we need to do to bring ourselves to compliance? So what I want to do here is bring you through the main sources of ammonia in agriculture and what we've done on those different sources with regards to research and, you know, ultimately what solutions there are. So if you look at the pie chart here, it's actually, well, it is what Daithí said, that majority of ammonia comes from animals and animal manures. So that's 90% in Ireland. Only 10% comes from synthetic fertilizer. And half of our ammonia emissions comes from manure management during housing, animal housing and storage of manures. And then the further 30% from land spreading, okay? And then 12% from grazing, which is actually quite an interesting breakdown. If you think about it, our housing period is relatively short. It's only maybe 2 to 4 months, depending on the or where in the country you are, what the weather is like, soil type, animals. So that short period when the animals are in the house, in the sheds, and then the resulting slurry storage, that's responsible for half of our ammonia, okay? Whereas our grazing season is extremely long, up to around 300 days. And that grazing only contributes 12% of ammonia, okay? So grazing in itself and extending grazing length is a mitigation measure for ammonia emissions because, you know, there is no long manure management chain where that manure is deposited in the house and stored and land spread, and at all these different steps there can be ammonia emissions associated with it, okay? So I'll start with those kind of largest sources being housing, then storage, land spreading. So when it comes to ammonia from housing, what you see here is photos from a study from a few years ago from one of my colleagues that measured ammonia emissions in animal houses. So the graph here indicates emissions from 4 different buildings, A, B, C, and D, and the different bars are associated with different sides of the building. And then the bar at the very end, if I can point that, this is the total for the different sides of the building. And what you can see here very clearly from that graph, it's very variable. Okay, so there's a large variability in the types of buildings we have, in their architecture, in how they're positioned towards the wind, and how much ammonia they actually emit. Okay, so on that, there's also so there is difference between those buildings. There is difference between as well whether the shed is slatted or, for example, straw-based on a solid floor. So we know that slatted sheds actually emit more ammonia than straw-based, than deep bedding. And what I'd like to draw your attention to is what I was saying, it is that large nitrogen loss pathway. So here, even if we look at the kind of smaller losses from building B to D, we're talking at approximately 0.5 kilogram of nitrogen, not even ammonia, but pure nitrogen in that ammonia gas every day. So if we're talking about a 2 month housing period, excuse me, that's 30 kilograms of ammonia. If we're talking about 4 months housing, that's already 60 kilograms. So that's a large loss of nitrogen if you think about it. So that's why that's actually a substantial part of our inventory. So the question around mitigation of those losses, well, there's a number of technological solutions for houses, such as scrapers, washing of those scraped surfaces, different floor designs, such as creating slopes, urine channels so that it can drain, separating urine and dung, having slat mats and plus they might even have valves to further separate dung from urine. So there's a number of things that can be done there technologically. There are some additives that can be added onto floor surface that have been tested in smaller scale studies that looked promising. And the other kind of big thing is actually at the very, very top of that. It's nothing to do with building of the house and with any engineering solution. It's actually reducing crude protein content in animal diets. So this is very easy. Basically, less nitrogen coming into the diet, there's less nitrogen coming out the back end. So it means there's less nitrogen in that slurry, and that leads to lower emissions. Okay, so that's one actually big one, and reducing housing length, so extended grazing that I've already mentioned kind of at the very beginning. And just to give you an example, one of the studies that we've done in Johnstown, one of my colleagues worked on looking at scraping and washing yards and in general hard surfaces. And there's a huge amount of ammonia that can be saved if those surfaces are cleaned relatively quickly after deposition. So for example, scrapers working inside the shed, if they scrape the surface every 3 hours, they can reduce ammonia emissions by around 50%. If they scrape every hour, they can reduce ammonia by nearly 80%. So that's a huge reduction there. On the slurry storage side, as I said, majority of our sheds are actually slatted houses with slurry storage underneath. So that makes it a bit more difficult because we're limited in what we can do in that slurry storage. If there are outdoor tanks, then we can cover them. That's very effective. But if there's slatted sheds with animals above them, there's limited things that we can do. So in Johnstown, we've been working on different slurry additives, looking at basically a smaller versions of slurry tanks, all the way from kind of very small vessels to kind of larger scale to those kind of meso-scale tanks. When we simulate the slurry storage and can measure emissions from it kind of a very controlled and replicated manner. What we've seen so far is that this is quite well known internationally, that acidic amendments such as sulfuric acid, ferric chloride, they can reduce ammonia emissions and also methane emissions very effectively. But what we've also looked at, there's been more work done in Johnstown. We looked at emissions in storage and at land spreading and how those different amendments pan out. So while our acidifiers are very effective when it comes to reducing emissions in storage, what might happen is as we retain more nitrogen in that slurry, we will increase, for example, nitrous oxide emissions after land spreading, okay? Similarly, when we tried different kind of waste stream materials from agriculture and food production, we've seen some success in reducing ammonia emissions. However, some of them increased methane emissions. So it's not a very easy story to tell. Where we tested commercial amendments, here we actually haven't really seen any promising results in reducing emissions. So this isn't maybe an easy message to say. And what I, the kind of take home message from this is the nitrogen flows in one way. So once the animal excretes the nitrogen, it kind of moves from housing, storage to land spreading, and it can be lost at any of those stages. So when we talk about slurry amendments in storage, we amend here, we can still then lose that nitrogen at spreading. So realistically, what we should be targeting is either reducing emissions at spreading, because that is that last step of the flow, and also at the first stage, so with reducing crude protein, okay, going in. So without kind of spending too much time on it, I'll move on to then slurry spreading. And what we do know very well is that ammonia emissions occur very quickly, and they are weather dependent, with typically losses being high in the summer. Okay. What we know as well is there is a huge difference between splash plate and low emission slurry spreading. So we know from previous work in Johnstown and internationally, when you're land spreading, when you're just broadcasting your slurry, you can lose up to half of available nitrogen from that slurry, and very, very quickly. So that half nitrogen gone. If you move to low emission slurry spreading, you can reduce that loss substantially. It's still quite large, 19%, nearly 20% of available nitrogen. That's still substantial, but it's much better than losing 50%. Okay, and that's from previous research. What the values that EPA uses, which are obviously averages for the whole country and for summer separately, for spring and autumn separately, we assume that there is a 30% reduction in ammonia emissions with a trailing hose, 60% reduction with a trailing shoe, and injection offers a further 10%. So it goes down to 70% reduction. Okay, so they're substantial, but there's actually still a lack of values kind of locally in Ireland. So more research is still needed, even though it is widely accepted technology, just to know exactly how much we can reduce emissions. And based on that, that's why we're currently undertaking a new project, which is that's probably one of the largest scales that we've been working on in measuring ammonia at kind of sub-paddock scales and at very high frequency. We're using standard methods. What you see here is mass with passive samplers, and a laser that we use that gives us very high frequency measurements. And what we see based on the laser measurements, we've never been able to see that kind of temporal resolution of results. There's those. What we knew about splash plate is that it creates a quick burst of very high concentrations. That comes through even clearer now with the laser measurements. We see how much larger those concentrations are comparing to the low emission spreaders such as trailing shoe and injection. So it just shows you how critically important those first few hours and the first day of application is. That's really where all the nitrogen is being lost. Okay. At the plot scale, we're also looking at not only ammonia, but also on the on other environmental parameters and yields, for example. So looking at a number of slurry amendments here and comparing to protected urea and fertilized control, we looked at slurry with sulfuric acid, biochar, and gypsum or lactogypsum, which is a slightly acidic soil improver. There has been no statistical difference in yields over 3 harvests last year. So it's a 3-cut silage system over 2 different soil types. So it kind of clearly shows that we need to be very, very cautious about what we think, or how much maybe faith we have in a lot of different slurry amendments. Okay, so that's on the slurry side. And just very quickly on the fertilizer side, with what we know is not all fertilizers are the same. There's a huge amount of difference there between emissions associated with CAN, urea, and protected urea. So that's really where the protected urea message comes from. Where you can lose approximately 15% of nitrogen by spreading straight urea, that goes down to just over 3% with protected urea. So it's a huge difference. But a word of caution is, working previously in Johnstown, what we've seen is during the weather conducive to ammonia loss, unprotected straight urea can have loss of nitrogen of over 40%. So, for every €100 of nitrogen spread, that's over €40 gone without any impact on yield. Whereas protected urea is here at the bottom, and it can substantially reduce losses there. And the one thing about it is, it's not only about the different forms of fertilizer, but also in general, with the farm to fork strategy, Ireland has basically committed to reduce fertilizer rates by 20%. And with the soaring fertilizer prices, everyone is looking at alternative solutions. So really, we need to be thinking about increasing our nitrogen use efficiency by using those low emission slurry spreading, liming, clover, mixed species swords. So everything that can bring us closer to, to reducing synthetic N. And where I'll finish on is just on what I mentioned before, is the marginal abatement cost curve for ammonia. And it basically brings all of the research that we've done in Teagasc here into one benchmarking exercise, where it looks at all the different mitigation options. And each bar is a separate mitigation option. The width of the bar shows how much mitigation we can get. The height of the bar is the cost of it. And really the take-home message from here is, if you look at that graph, what really stands out is the low emission slurry spreading, especially for bovines, and protected urea. And those two alone can provide 80% of ammonia mitigation to bring us closer to compliance. Okay, so I'll finish on that. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing. And apologies, I've gone a little bit over time.
Okay. I think that was absolutely fascinating, and the reactions we're getting are really appreciative of the amount of information that you've imparted in the last 40 minutes. So I think it'll take people a while to take it all in. A lot of questions coming through, and I'll maybe just start with one for Dahi, and just said, thanks for a great talk. If the Irish NEC directive targets are reached and ammonia reduction are reached, and we get to below the limits, will this be sufficient to achieve the ecological targets to protect sensitive ecosystems, or will there need to be more stringent targets in certain areas?
It'll certainly help, no doubt about that, but that's focusing on contribution to national emissions, whereas you will definitely need to have more localized focus on contributions to specific sites. So you maybe some sites may have, if you're directly downwind or upwind of a sensitive site, you may need to have more restrictions potentially than a site which is not. But I would say, yeah, there will need to be more focused attempts to reduce contributions to sensitive sites beyond just the blanket approach to reducing the national ceiling, emissions below national ceiling.
And again, I suppose one of the questions is relates to the impacts, and I suppose they're specifically talking about the health impacts. Are they more noticeable in areas on a more easterly, where there's been more accumulated ammonia emissions across the country than are observed in say Western towns and cities?
We tried to look at this, but we don't. Unfortunately, Ireland doesn't have the resolution of data required to make such assessments. So the short answer is we don't know. Okay, Pádraig, if you want to take up some of the many questions that are coming in there.
And they're coming in hot and fast. And obviously you can put in your questions in the Q&A section. Dominique, you finished up, you wrapped up there with a look on the MAC curve. There's a question in here, do you reckon they will have the high fertilizer prices will have any impact on the MAC curve? Obviously people are putting more attention on the use of less to make better value of nitrogen as it stands. So will 2022 be the year that we'll see a difference from the get-go?
Look, it's maybe a silver lining to a bad situation in terms of the high fertilizer prices, but then the difficulties with ammonia compliance and with greenhouse gases, water quality as well. So I think this is nearly a kind of a perfect storm situation where we will see, we are already seeing farmers really looking for alternative solutions, and when nitrogen is cheap, there's nothing stopping anyone to buy more and apply more, and it's maybe not that much appreciated. Now it's really coming to the fore that we need to try to work with less and get the most out of it. So it's really looking at those mitigation measures. So definitely, yeah.
Yeah, cheap nitrogen is definitely a thing of the past.
I remember when it was cheap. That was,
Okay. Has anaerobic digestion a role to play at regional level in order to reduce ammonia emissions? Obviously, with the price of fertilizer, slurry will be remaining on farms, but if a percentage was diverted to anaerobic digestion, would this help?
So it's an interesting one, because the question is what happens with the digestate after. So in the anaerobic digestion process, what happens with the slurry is the carbon gets taken out for biogas production, but the nitrogen not only remains, but majority of nitrogen in slurry is in the organic form. But after the digestion process, it moves to more mineral. Okay, so even after 100% of that nitrogen in the digestate is plant available. So on one hand, it is a very good source of fertilizer because that nitrogen is plant available. On the other hand, what means plant available is also ammonia loss available. So where we have to be very careful is that material has to be spread using low emission slurry spreading.
Okay. Dahi, one that came in for you was, and I see you're answering some of these as well, but if one I guess everybody is thinking similar thing, they may not get a chance to ask. So how can deposited nitrogen acidify? Isn't it alkaline?
Oh yeah, so I just answered that one. So it is alkaline, of course, but what happens is and again, to point out, I'm not an expert on the acidification element because it's not a huge component in terms of the impacts. Now that acidification isn't, the acid rain isn't really an issue in Ireland anymore. But it's the hydrogen ions. So it's hydrogen ions in the soil causes soil acidification. So that's the mode of how it acidifies, even though it is itself alkaline.
Okay. Do algal slimes have any useful purpose?
Not that I could see. No.
That was a pretty straight answer. All right. Is there any separate research being done on the impacts on the aquatic component of Natura sites, or is the monitoring done in the water bodies as well as on the bogs themselves?
Okay, well, so the way this works, the lakes, vast majority of lakes will be more heavily impacted by the likes of runoff than they will be contributions from atmospheric deposition. Atmospheric deposition will play a role, but it's minor compared to other sources of nitrogen that they're receiving elsewhere. However, upland lakes are more of an issue because upland lakes, what you have is, agriculture isn't an issue or runoff isn't an issue up there. But what happens is you get particulate ammonium can be transported up to these upland lakes. So because they travel greater distances. So can go up the mountains, no problem, and then it's deposited in these lakes, which can potentially cause an issue. But they're being monitored, and they're going to be part of the actual National Emission Ceiling Directive monitoring in Ireland, where the proposal is that they will monitor these sites semi-continuously at least for those impacts. So uplands, yes, lowlands an issue, but not as substantial as the other sources of nitrogen.
Okay. Dominica, the national herd hasn't really moved in the last 20 years if you look at all the animal numbers. So how come it's becoming a problem just now? I guess that's one question that's in. And just to add to that, you mentioned the use of scrapers and running them every hour versus every 3 hours. And just people wondering, is there any comparison done between the reduction in ammonia emissions versus the intensive use of electricity?
Okay, so on the herd side is while the numbers are relatively stable. It's the structure that changes, okay? And the excretion rates from dairy animals are much higher than from beef herd. So what happens with the number of beef animals falling and with the dairy animals increasing, they're kind of, they're usually fed higher end diet. They have high an excretion rate. I can't remember off the top of my head now what it is. I used to remember. You might know. You might be able to help me out here. But it's the structure of the national herd that's changing, and that's causing basically more nitrogen being excreted in the system. In terms of the scrapers, that's a good question, and I honestly don't know, because that's more so, like, for example, electricity, that would be outside my area of expertise. It's more of a kind of LCA, I think, methodology to look at the emissions associated with that energy generation.
Understandable. An expert in ammonia doesn't need to be an expert in electricity as well. But here's one from an ammonia point of view. Why do slatted sheds emit more ammonia than a straw bedded shed?
I think it comes down to what happens to excreta after they hit the floor, and how they hit the floor. So in the slatted shed, they kind of sit on the surface of the slats, whereas in the straw they kind of infiltrate more easily. So what happens with ammonia emissions are usually associated with the surface. So the larger the surface of the larger the surface of kind of the emitter, be it a dung pat or slurry being spread on the surface, the more ammonia is emitted. So if that material infiltrates better and mixes in with the straw, that kind of that reduces those losses. So that's basically how the low emission slurry spreading works as well. So rather than broadcasting slurry, it's depositing either in bands, in bands either on top of the grass, or kind of parting the grass and going on the surface. So it's basically reducing that emitting surface and also improving infiltration.
Okay, you've mentioned obviously that one of the major benefits of extending the grazing season is the reduction in ammonia. So majority of ammonia sources are due to housing of livestock and associated slurry storage. Extending the grazing season should help reduce ammonia by reducing the requirement for housing. Agroforestry in Northern Ireland found to extend grazing by 13 to 17 weeks per year as compared to the adjacent pasture control treatment. Trees also capture ammonia and can be used as screens around housing for ammonia capture. Has there been any work done on living barns, i.e. outwintering livestock?
With agroforestry, I think we're very lacking in that area. I know the colleagues in Northern Ireland have that long-term work on agroforestry, which we are very jealous about, and we've been for the last few years putting in bids for funding for work like that, and it just hasn't materialized in terms of agroforestry and its impacts in general on the farming system. On the outwintering itself, there has been a little bit of work done. Conor Dowling did that a few years ago. That's when I was Conor was finishing his PhD when I was starting mine. So some of it is a little bit older stuff, and I suppose overwintering wouldn't really be. He was working on overwintering pads. It's not really a popular solution in Ireland, so there is kind of limited research there in that area.
And it's similar type question, I guess, is there anything being done around planting trees in farmyards? Obviously, there's a lot of that taking place, even with Glanbia's sustainability move to plant 1,000 trees, I think it is. Is it something that farmers should be looking at?
Look, we've kind of started looking at it, and it's obviously a long-term research, because whenever you plant something, it's waiting on a few years to get any impact from those planted trees. So it's a long-term gain. But I would never say no to planting anything. We know that that while we might not have the actual figures we know from international work that this works in capture ammonia, and for other benefits, obviously. Now, Dahi might go into more detail on how kind of shelter belts like that would be most effective. But what's the is there any harm from from planting more trees?
Always a good move, yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. More trees is always a good thing, but just to highlight that to function effectively as a shelter belt, I was talking to the guys that do the research on this, last week, and they again highlighted that you need at least a minimum depth of 10 meters, so 10 meters along that the stretch of wherever you're trying to block the ammonia getting to start functioning as an effective shelter belt. A minimum, so you say 10, 20, or 30 meters would be optimum, but that's quite a large lump of land to capture the ammonia downwind effectively. Yeah. But again, I'm all for planting trees wherever you can.
Sticking with the tree kind of thing, is there any research being done? And I know you've answered this in the chat already, but just for everyone else watching, is there any research being done on the impact of ammonia and the link with fungal disease and ash dieback, cankers, etc.?
There's been work done. I remember looking at a review paper a few years ago that very clearly stated ammonia does exacerbate impacts such as from fungal diseases, droughts, and frost damage as well. But I don't know of any connection specifically to likes of ash dieback or cankers, but broad spectrum, it does exacerbate other impacts.
In a straw-bedded situation, Dominica, is the ammonia not eventually released when the final farmyard manure is taken out of the shed and it's cleaned out and obviously spread on the land? Would be very noticeable in cleaning out of poultry sheds when wood shavings are used. Just a comment on that.
You would, obviously, that ammonia is going to move at the end when you land spread farmyard manure, but the farmyard manure is associated with much lower ammonia emission factor upon land spreading than slurry, and that's my understanding is primarily because most of the nitrogen is in the organic form.
Okay, you're more or less answering the next question, because with that, if a cover is put on a stored slurry to stop emissions of ammonia, does the ammonia not just get released when the cover is removed? So maybe just explain that for people.
So, okay, there's a number of different ways that you can cover slurry. And obviously kind of nearly the harder the cover, the better. So you can have flexible covers or you can have hard covers, and the hard covers would stop pretty much 100% of ammonia, while the flexible covers might have varying degrees of reduction depending on how much air movement there is. But at the very basic level, a cover for slurry is slurry crust. Okay, so as long as there's, a crusted slurry will have lower emissions than, for example, uncrusted slurry. So it's not necessarily when you uncover the store that you'll automatically lose a huge amount of ammonia. There will be kind of a gaseous balance above that, above the slurry surface and kind of inside the closed store. What will happen is once you break down the crust and agitate to spread the slurry, that will create a burst of ammonia, and then again when you spread it out on the field. So there's kind of certain things that will never be able to maybe reduce emissions 100%, but it's about that being mindful to know where we can mitigate the losses and trying to not focus on those areas. I mean, we should be trying to reduce ammonia in all areas, but kind of being mindful in where we can create the biggest impact, and not kind of undo something good that we've done. That's kind of what I meant maybe with the additives, and how you can then use, or with the anaerobic digestate, that you need to spread them with low emission slurry spreading.
Sorry, Pat, go ahead.
There's a couple of questions in there around the amount of the acids that need to be used per cubic meter to have the effect, and then a related question on whether or not there's any observable impact on soil when you use these products?
Okay, so in terms of volume of acid, it depends on the slurry. So I wouldn't be able to tell you off the top of my head what the volume of acid is. We needed to calculate it and then check it for each slurry that we had. It depends on slurry dry matter and nutrient content, because slurry has a few buffering. It has a really large buffering capacity. It has a few kind of mechanisms that buffers the pH. So in order to drop the pH, you need to break through that buffering capacity, and each slurry will be different. So, you know, we have 2 farms in Johnstown, a beef and dairy, and if I take those 2 slurries, they will be different. So it's amending to a given pH. And for example, in commercial acidification situations, be it in Denmark or other countries, what happens is there is a pH sensor you know, that measures the slurry pH and doses acid as needed. So regarding the volumes, I wouldn't know off the top of my head now, because it is slurry specific. On the impact on soil, we're actually, so that's what we're working on at the moment. So we don't, you know, I don't have any data to show for it yet. I should at the end of this year. From international work, what we know from colleagues from the UK is they haven't seen much they haven't seen any deterioration in soil quality over that time. So for slurry spreading, so acidification can happen at 2 stages, either in the tank or in the tanker, while when you go out with a slurry tanker to spread. So, and depending on those 2 stages, you amend to a different pH. So you need a lower pH in the storage than you would for the acidification in tanker. What even the commercial companies say is, if they were going down to the same level as in storage, that's a huge amount of acid they would need. It wouldn't really work in the tanker. And then, yes, there would be maybe more of an issue with dropping soil pH. But as it is, the pH of acidified slurry that goes out to be spread on land, it's somewhere between 6 and 6.5. So it's not, it's not going to have a massive acidifying impact.
Okay. Any final questions, Pádraig? We're nearly out of time.
I say we'll go back to Dai for one, try to keep a bit of balance. You showed pretty geographically the impacts on an image I had there when you showed the video and the mosses. How does this feed through to the species such as flies, worms, frogs, and ecosystems as a whole?
So just say that read the question one more time.
You showed pretty geographically the impact of ammonia on mosses and so on. How does this feed through to the species such as flies, worms, frogs, and ecosystems as a whole?
Okay, so you're talking, I guess the question then is around secondary impacts, which again it's an emerging field at the minute, which I've not looked into. I've been looking into source of getting funding to look at avenues like that, but it's really the research is internationally, it's only getting to that point of following through the trophic chains and what impacts the say, for example, if you impact on a lichen that is eaten by another animal, say for example a carry slug. Carry slugs part of the diet are lichens, so if you're impacting the lichen that carry slug eats, you're impacting on the carry slug. Similarly, if you're impacting on header, which is another impact, then you typically you get stunted header when you're exposed to ammonia. Tall header is internationally that's a preference for hen harrier for their nesting sites. So you're affecting potentially the hen harrier's preference in nesting grounds. So there is potential impacts. They've not been quantified, or the connections haven't been made sufficiently yet to say impacting this will cause an impact on a bird or on a species. But there is theoretically connections there. But as I said, it's an emerging science that has a lot of work yet to be done on it.
So we'll have a presentation on it this time next year.
Darn right.
We'll talk it down. Nice simple question to wrap up, Pat. Thanks.
Okay, listen, thank you very much. And there's been huge interest in terms of questions. We've only got around to, unfortunately, to a fraction of the questions that were asked, but hopefully the answers you've given have been really insightful. And I think there is more in this topic at some point in the future. So thank you very much to Dahi and Dominica for your presentations. They've been really excellent. Next week we have, I suppose, in some respects to follow on from this, we have nutrient tips to save money and reduce emissions. So we have Dr. Patrick Forrestal talking about that, and as you're probably aware, he's done a lot of work on protected urea, so that's going to be part of that story, and ammonia is going to be part of that story as well. I'd like to thank our production team, Yvonne Marr and Andy Boland, and hopefully we'll see you again this time next week. So thanks to all. Bye.